In June of 1941, the North Sea lay cold and gray beneath a heavy sky. A Royal Air Force Wellington bomber, its engines trembling with exhaustion, pushed homeward through sheets of flak. Inside the aircraft, Flight Lieutenant Dominic Bruce sat at his navigator's table, pencil steady despite the shaking metal around him. He was 26 years old, small, serious, with the quick eyes of a man used to both risk and calculation. The mission had been long, the return longer. When the searchlights found them, the crew had only seconds before the sky turned white with explosions. The bombers staggered, one engine trailing fire, and Bruce knew what was coming. He folded his chart, glanced once toward the pilot, and waited for the order he already expected. It came in a shout, shouting, "Bail out." He jumped into darkness. The air rushed past like a solid thing. Then came the cold of the sea, colder than anything he had ever imagined. He floated for hours, clinging to a fragment of wreckage, the horizon a thin line of iron against the dawn. When at last he heard the distant throb of engines, it was not rescue but capture. A German patrol boat pulled him aboard. A soldier offered a blanket, another a cup of hot coffee. His war as an airman was over. Another, quieter war was about to begin. Dominic Bruce was born in 1915 in Hebron, a shipbuilding town on the River Tyne. His father worked the docks. His mother kept the family together through the hard years between the wars. The boy grew up under skies black with coal smoke, and he longed for air that was clean. At 20, he joined the Royal Air Force, one of the few chances open to a working-class man to rise above the pit and the yard. He proved quick at navigation, precise with instruments, and unusually calm under pressure. Fellow flyers said he had a monk's composure. Some called him the flying monk. In 1938, he married Mary Brigid Lagan, a teacher from Ireland. Her letters, written in careful handwriting and smelling faintly of soap and ink, would travel farther than either of them could imagine. When the war began, Bruce's world became the night sky. He learned to steer bombers by stars hidden behind clouds, to measure a life in fuel minutes and bearing lines. He was not reckless, but steady, the kind of man crews trusted. By the summer of 1941, he had flown dozens of operations. He had seen flak tear through wings, and tracer fire stitch the dark. He knew that luck, not courage, often decided who came home. That June night, his luck ended. From the sea, he was taken through a sequence of interrogations. Zeebrugge, Frankfurt, then deeper into Germany. The rooms were clean, the questions polite but relentless. He gave only name, rank, and number. A young German interpreter offered him a cigarette and asked why the British kept fighting when defeat was certain. Bruce said nothing, and the interpreter smiled as though at a stubborn child. A week later, he was on a train heading for the first of many prisons. Spangenberg Castle was ancient stone turned to iron purpose. Behind its walls, hundreds of captured officers passed their days in dull repetition. Roll call, exercise, inspection. For many it was bearable. For Bruce it was not. He studied the layout, the guards, the shadows that fell across the yard at different hours. The thought of confinement pressed on him more heavily than the cold. Escape became not a plan, but a necessity. A way to remain himself. His first attempt was crude, a tunnel begun under the floorboards of a store hut. It collapsed after a week. The second ended when a guard noticed that Bruce's boots were muddy at morning roll call. He was given solitary confinement, a narrow cell, a wooden stool, a bucket, a ration of bread and water. He scratched small crosses into the wall to mark the days. He prayed quietly, less for release than for the strength not to break. When he emerged, thinner but unbowed, the guards treated him with a wary respect. Transferred to another camp, Warburg, he met other restless men. Officers who considered it their duty to escape as often as possible. They exchanged tricks for smuggling maps, for dyeing uniforms, for disguising themselves as workmen. Bruce learned German from captured pamphlets and practiced forging signatures. Every failure taught him something. He was caught climbing a fence disguised as an orderly, caught again hiding in a supply truck. Each time the same punishment, the same gray cell, the same stubborn resolve. In 1942 he was sent to the place reserved for the incorrigible, the fortress of Colditz. Perched on a cliff above the Mulde River, Colditz was both medieval and modern. High walls, deep cellars, and a garrison determined to make it escape-proof. The Germans called it the camp for the bad boys, and they were not wrong. Within those walls were the most ingenious prisoners of the war: engineers, actors, linguists, magicians of deception. They built gliders in attics, forged passes, and sewed German uniforms from captured cloth. The castle buzzed with conspiracy. Bruce entered this world with the quiet intensity of a man who had found his true profession. He became part of the escape committee, a network of officers who approved every attempt to ensure that no man's plan endangered another's. He was valued for his patience and his size, small enough to fit where others could not. He also taught French and helped organize lectures, a thin cover for hours spent observing routines. The guards called him Kleiner Engländer, the little Englishman. They laughed when he walked past, never suspecting that he was studying the rhythm of their laughter, the pattern of their roots. One day he noticed the Red Cross crates that arrived regularly, wooden tea chests filled with medical supplies and food parcels. After inspection, the empty crates were carried out to be refilled. The idea came quietly and grew quickly. If a man could hide inside one of those boxes, sealed and carried past the gates, he might reach the outer compound unseen. From there, night and luck would have to do the rest. The plan required trust. 2 companions helped him measure and prepare a crate large enough to hold him curled inside. They drilled small air holes and left a thin tube for breathing. On the inner wall, Bruce chalked a message: "The air in Colditz no longer agrees with me." He climbed in, knees to chest, while his friends nailed the lid shut. For hours he lay in darkness as the crate was lifted, bumped, and set down again. He felt sweat trickle down his face and forced himself to count each heartbeat to keep from shouting. When the movement stopped and silence returned, he waited another hour before pushing the lid free. He emerged into a storeroom beyond the inner gate. The night was cold, the courtyard empty. Using a rope made of knotted bedsheets, he climbed down the outer wall, skin tearing on the stone. Below, the river glinted faintly in moonlight. He reached the bank, stole a bicycle, and began to ride. For several days he moved eastward through Saxony, posing as a foreign laborer. He begged for food, slept in barns, and followed back roads toward what he believed might lead to neutral territory. Freedom was a landscape of risk. Near Danzig, nearly 400 miles from Colditz, a patrol stopped him. They asked for papers. He had none. His German faltered. Within hours he was back in custody. The guards at Colditz could not decide whether to punish or admire him. The commandant ordered solitary confinement again, but privately told an aide, "That little man is dangerous only because he believes." Weeks passed in the dark. Bruce filled his mind with memory, verses, prayers, fragments of flight calculations. He whispered to himself in French, German, and Latin, so that language would not desert him. Sometimes he imagined walking home along the Tyne, the air smelling of salt and coal, Mary waiting at the door. The thought was both comfort and torment. The guards fled or surrendered. The gates opened, and for the first time in nearly 4 years, Bruce walked through without disguise or fear. He paused in the courtyard, looking back at the towers and walls that had been both enemy and teacher. Then he turned and joined the column of freedmen moving down the road toward life. Peace can be stranger than war. Returning to England, Bruce found a country changed yet familiar, the same gray skies, the same polite cues, the same quiet grief in faces. He reunited with Mary, but sleep was restless. He woke often at night, half expecting searchlights through the window or the clang of the morning bell. Gradually, normal life returned its rhythm. He entered Oxford, studied philosophy and education, and later became a headmaster known for strict fairness. Students remembered his small smile, his patience, and the way he insisted that rules mattered only if tempered by mercy. He rarely spoke of the war. When asked about his medals, the Military Cross and the Air Force Medal, an almost unique combination, he changed the subject. Yet the war never entirely left him. At times he would pause mid-sentence, listening to some inner echo, then continue as if nothing had happened. He kept the habits of captivity, folding his clothes precisely, counting steps from desk to door, saving bits of string. When colleagues discovered the story of the tea chest escape, he laughed it off as youthful foolishness. But those who knew him sensed that beneath the laughter lay something deeper, a memory of the small space where he had once hidden and the larger freedom it represented. In his later years he reflected that courage was not the absence of fear but the refusal to let fear dictate behavior. He had not been fearless when he climbed into that crate or down that wall. He had been terrified, but he had acted anyway. To him, that was the measure of freedom, the ability to choose defiance even when defeat seemed certain. Many men died in captivity. Many more survived by surrendering inwardly long before the gates opened. Bruce refused to do either. His struggle was not for escape alone, but for identity, to prove that even in chains a man might remain himself. In that sense, every attempt, even those that failed, was a victory. He lived quietly after retirement, tending a small garden, reading theology and poetry. When interviewed late in life, he was asked what had kept him going through those years. He replied simply, faith, friends, and the thought of home. There was no bitterness in his voice, only the calm of a man who had measured suffering and found it bearable. He died in 2000, aged 84. Obituaries mentioned the daring escapes and the medals, but those who knew him remembered something else: his courtesy, his humor, and the light in his eyes when he spoke of the sea. The legend of Colditz would live on, but within that legend, his name remained a quiet footnote. One more man among many who refused to accept captivity as destiny. The meaning of his story lies not in success but persistence. He escaped the walls only once for a few days. Yet in truth, he escaped every day he refused to submit. His defiance was an act of faith that the human spirit cannot be contained by stone or wire. To younger generations, his life stands as reminder that freedom is not granted by circumstance, but created by choice. When people read his story now, they see ingenuity and courage. But what matters most is the moral clarity behind them. Dominic Bruce never hated his captors. He believed they were also prisoners of fear, of obedience, of a system that demanded cruelty as duty. In one letter he wrote, "To live without hope is to die in captivity." Even if the body stays behind bars, the mind must keep walking. That sentence could stand as his epitaph. He was a navigator before he was a prisoner, and perhaps that never changed. He had spent his life charting courses through darkness, first in the night skies over Europe, then within the walls of a fortress. The stars he once followed were replaced by small acts of endurance, yet both required the same discipline: to hold a line, to trust that beyond the storm lies direction. In an age where the meaning of courage is often measured by noise, his was the quiet kind, the courage to endure, to resist despair, to maintain decency when decency seemed impossible. The walls of Colditz are now a museum. Visitors walk through its courtyards and peer into cells where names are carved in plaster. Among them is his small and neat, a trace of a man who refused to be forgotten by those stones. The man who would not stay captive did not conquer nations or command armies. He conquered himself. And in that victory lies something rarer than glory, the simple, enduring truth that freedom begins where fear ends.